Welcome to this video on experimenting with texture in acrylic painting. As you can see from a few samples I have here, I've played around with some different techniques, painting with dark backgrounds, letting water absorb into the surface, flicking specks of water and pulling it off. You can see there's a little example of pulling paint off that's partially dry, masking over the top of some of these things. So these are just a few little techniques that I partially have introduced in previous videos, and I'm going to show you how to do a lot of this in this video. So just hang in there. I want to start by putting a ground down, just like discussed in a previous video, but this time I'm going to go with a dark ground. I'm not worried about it being perfect because this is an experiment. This is not about being product driven. And while that dries, I'm going to put another ground down. And each time I do a ground with these type of experiments, I try to be a little bit different. So here I'm not incorporating the paint too much. I'm even introducing some other colors loosely, which I'm then going to blend together with a large 4-inch brush here, you can see. And I'm just loosely scraping that surface. Now I'm going to soak the paper and use a watercolor technique here by dotting the surface with semi-loose paint, meaning that that paint's already had some water mixed into it, so that the two surfaces which are wet are going to flow. If you play with variations in how wet the paint is, you're going to get different effects, which I think is really important. Now I'm going to switch to this little scraper here, this little silicone scraper, but you can use anything that's going to scrape, and you can see that it's nice because while the paint is still wet, it's actually creating a nice little texture, but it's not removing all of the paint. It's only removing some of the paint. So I'm just playing with a little bit of a simple pattern there, not being too careful. And of course, we have to think about how acrylic paint dries. So with a partially dry ground there, I'm flicking some water dots on there, and I'm going to let those etch into the surface for a little while. So while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to work on this ombre here from a pink to sort of a dark violet ombre. And I'm just going to loosely blend them together, which I'm going to use for a different effect later. Now that those flecks of paint, or excuse me, flecks of water have soaked into the surface a tiny bit, I'm going to pull it off. You can see here just by moving the brush across, and you can just see it. It's pulling some of that paint out, creating those little dots. They almost look like acid wash jeans dots, which I think are a really nice little effect. When that dries, it's going to be very flat and it's going to look almost photographic. It's not going to look painterly, which is sometimes a very difficult technique to get. Okay, so now that that paint has set up a little bit, I'm going to move into the next phase of this little process here. Pulling a little bit more. Now I'm just going to go into a straight experimentation. This is really fun, but also maybe risky. So you can see I'm using a sponge here to create little texture, almost like concrete texture, and I'm going to let that set up and see what it does. I'm not in love with it right now, but that's fine. Now I'm going to switch to the wood graining tool. The wood graining tool is a tool that I bought that you can get at any hardware store. And all you need is paint underneath that's dry, and then wet paint over the top. So you can see here I'm using a high contrast overlay of paint, just with a white and blue mixture. I'm not being very careful about it at all because I'm going to scrape the majority of this off. So just let that sit there for a second. You can play around with drying times. I like to go straight into it. And just by pulling and rocking that little tool gently, you can see that it creates a very believable and very fun and expressive wood grain. Try to vary the way you do it each time so that you're not creating the exact same mark with each pull. You can see you can push, get that little edge there. And that's a lot of fun. You can really have some fun with that. And while that paint's still in my cup, I'm going to just use it to play around with some other textures. This process of experimenting is so important to the development of an artist. You can see here I'm just using wet paint now, and I'm just dripping it right on the surface, but of course now I've got to let it dry. So I probably had to use the blow dryer for a solid 15 minutes to get everything dry and ready for the next phase. And the next phase is really a glazing phase. This is where I'm going to mix up a transparent layer of paint. You can see here I'm making sure that the surface is totally dry. And that can only be done one way, that's with your hands. I'm looking for areas like that that are slightly wet, so I'm not going to glaze on that bottom left panel. But I'm going to use this acrylic matte medium, which is clear paint, and I'm going to mix, if I can get the bottle open, I'm going to mix that into a tray with my pigment. Now it's important that the paint is transparent, no white here at all. I'm going to mix that up nice and thoroughly. If you don't mix it up enough, you're going to get streakiness in your glaze, and that doesn't really work. The idea of the glaze is to have like a thin, transparent color film over the top of your paint so that you can still see what's underneath it, but you're basically adding a color to it. You can think of this also in photographic terms as a gel. Once this has been completely mixed together, then I'll just need to add a little bit of water to loosen it up, and I'll be able to apply it right over the top. So I'm wanting to work fairly quickly here. The thinner the paint, obviously, the faster it dries. I'm going to use a moist towel and wipe off what I don't want. And you can kind of spread it around. You can almost paint with this rag. I'm pulling it off kind of unevenly to make it look like aged wood, even though you probably wouldn't have purple painted white wood. Using this brush to sort of smooth it out. And while I have that glaze mixed, I'm going to paint a little bit of a vignette glaze over the top of the other piece here. And you can see that it's really dark when it goes on, so you do have to remove a little bit. And you want to play around with different materials. I'm using a microfiber cloth, which I found to be modestly effective. I probably would prefer a white cotton rag, like an old t-shirt or something. And then I'm just going to play around with different areas of glaze just to have some fun with it. The point of experimentation is to play, to do something that probably will fail, but is nevertheless interesting. If I do this whole painting and only 10% of it is really interesting, that's still 10% that I would not have found out otherwise. You can see I'm removing a little bit of extra paint there. But this process was not without some failure, so I'm just going to let you watch this awful experimentation here without comment for a few seconds. My first mistake was using vinyl tape instead of regular tape. Vinyl tape sticks really well to metal. It does not stick very well to paint. Now, pulling the tape off, you can see the tape barely did anything. And I had the thought of using a clean brush here to maybe clean out those little lines, and it wasn't doing anything. So, as has happened with many of my paintings over the years, I just jump ship here. So I'm just going to paint it out. That's introducing both pigment and water back to the surface, kind of adding a little bit more here. And then I'm just going to wipe the whole thing down, kind of giving up on it a little bit. I'm scraping off as much of the paint as I can, and that's just kind of, I don't know, seeing what will happen, but also getting rid of the evidence of that failed paint experiment. So I'm just using my dirty cloth here and just scrubbing it out, and I'm left with something of a hazy surface that just didn't work for me at all. So I'm going to end the experimentation there and just kind of take a look and see what I'm left with. I like doing this little approach here where I have 4 rectangles on a large piece of paper, as it sort of creates 4 examples of finished work, I guess, for lack of a better term. And you can see that there's some interesting things happening inside of all of these.